he dumped me with, "We'll always be friends, though." He said it gently, like he was handing me a consolation prize instead of walking away with half my life. I nodded. I even smiled. "Of course," I said, "because that's what you say when you're still standing in the wreckage and don't want him to see the smoke." Weeks later, I was still paying the rent he couldn't quite cover yet, still answering late-night calls about his anxiety, still lending my car when his broke down. Friendship apparently came with invoices, just not his. I remember the sound of his keys hitting the counter like they still belonged there, the way he sprawled on the couch we picked together, asking if I could spot him again. That was the moment something went quiet inside me. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just clear. And when I started seeing his roommate casually, politely, it wasn't revenge yet. It was gravity. Things finally falling where they should. I had been the steady one long before he left, good with numbers, good with silence, good at carrying weight without announcing it. We met when I was rebuilding myself after a small, private failure I never talk about, and he liked that I didn't need saving. Over time, that turned into something else. Dependable became invisible. Support became expected. I learned his moods the way you learn weather, by watching, adjusting, never asking the sky to apologize. Our relationship looked balanced from the outside. Inside, I paid attention. I remembered deadlines, smoothed his conflicts, covered the gaps when his confidence collapsed. He called it partnership. I called it effort. When he ended things, he said he needed space to grow, as if growth required my absence but not my help. I had been underestimated my whole life, mistaken for soft because I listened, mistaken for passive because I waited. People assumed my calm meant I didn't notice. They assumed my loyalty meant permanence. He assumed friendship meant access without responsibility. What he never understood was that I don't cling. I observe. And once I understand the pattern, I don't break it loudly. I step out of it and let the silence do the explaining. After the breakup, he stayed comfortable. Too comfortable. He used my name the way you use a key, casually assuming it would still open doors. He'd text you up? Instead of "Can I come by," already standing outside with that familiar half-smile. When I hesitated, just a beat too long, he'd laugh and say, "Relax, it's just me." As if me had ever been the problem. The insults were never loud. They arrived dressed as jokes. A pause before saying thank you. A glance at his phone while I spoke. The way he'd say, "You're so good at this stuff," whenever money or responsibility came up, like competence was my natural resource to be mined. Once, when I mentioned I was tired, he tilted his head and said, "You always handle things, though." Not a compliment. A verdict. Even after I told him I was seeing someone, left it vague on purpose, he smirked. "Already?" he asked, amused, unconcerned. His tone said temporary. Replaceable. He still borrowed my car that week. Still left dishes in my sink. Still assumed I'd be there when his day went wrong. I watched him carefully then. The pauses between words. The way respect only appeared when he needed something. And I felt the tension tighten. Not sharp, not explosive, but steady like a door slowly, deliberately closing. The turning point didn't arrive with an argument. It came on an ordinary Tuesday disguised as a favor. His car had finally died for good, and he asked, no, assumed, I'd drive him to work for a couple of weeks. He said it lightly, already reaching for his jacket, already halfway out the door. Something in his voice made it clear he'd planned this without me. I looked at him then, really looked. The relaxed posture. The certainty. The way my help had become part of his budgeting. And for the first time I saw the full shape of it. The breakup hadn't changed his life at all. It had only simplified it. He had kept the benefits and shed the responsibility. I said nothing right away. I just picked up my keys, turned them over in my palm, and felt how small they were. How easy it would be to hand them over. How much harder it would be not to. I can't, I said finally. Come. Neutral. True. He blinked, confused, like a script had gone missing. Since when? Since now. That was the moment. No raised voice. No explanation. just a boundary placed where an opening used to be. I watched him adjust poorly to the absence of my yes. And as the door closed behind him, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Enough wasn't anger. Enough was accuracy. I didn't plan revenge the way people imagine it. No lists, no late nights fueled by bitterness. I planned the way I handle everything else, quietly with facts. First, I separated what was shared from what was mine. Bills, accounts, subscriptions, anything my name touched, I reviewed. I'd always handled the paperwork anyway. This was just finishing the job properly. I work in contracts. I know how language hides obligations in friendly phrases. "We'll always be friends" means nothing on paper. I stopped anticipating his needs. That was the hardest habit to break. When a message came in, I read it once and waited. When he hinted instead of asking, I let the hint die where it landed. I documented everything, not to use against him, just to remind myself I wasn't imagining the pattern. At the same time, I made my own life smaller and stronger. Cleared debt. Redirected money he used to lean on. Reclaimed weekends. I didn't announce these changes. I let them register gradually, like a room cooling after the heat is turned off. Seeing his roommate wasn't part of the plan. That happened naturally. Conversations without history, respect without negotiation. Still, I was careful. No overlap. No gossip. No scenes. Revenge, I learned, doesn't need an audience. It needs structure. And once the structure changes, everything else follows, silently, inevitably. The payoff arrived without announcement. One morning, he realized the rent reminder hadn't been sent. The utilities stayed on, but only because they were finally in his name. My car keys remained on my hook. My couch stayed empty. I watched these absences register on his face in slow increments, like someone counting missing stairs in the dark. He knocked one evening, casual at first. "Hey," he said, scanning the room. It looked different, lighter. I had moved things, not dramatically, just enough to erase his muscle memory. When he asked if I could help him figure out a payment plan, I handed him the landlord's email. Nothing else. No commentary. No apology. A week later, he saw me with his roommate at a cafe across town. Not touching. Just leaning in, laughing softly. The roommate met my eyes with ease, no debt, no expectation. My ex hesitated on the sidewalk, calculating. Friendship, it turned out, didn't cover repairs, rides, or reassurance. It didn't pay when the car stalled or the silence set in. He texted later, "Can we talk?" I read it. I didn't reply. There was no confrontation to replay, no victory speech. Just the clean arithmetic of consequences. He lost access. I gained quiet. And in that quiet, everything finally added up. The fallout wasn't dramatic, it was awkward. Mutual friends noticed first. Invitations shifted. Questions arrived wrapped in concern. "Are you two okay?" And I answered honestly, briefly. He tried to keep the tone light, tried to sell the story that we were cool, but people felt the imbalance when he kept asking and I kept declining. Reputation has weight. So does restraint. His roommate stopped by less often than not at all, on his behalf, I think. Word travels quietly when favors dry up. The landlord addressed emails to him alone. Mechanics stopped hearing my name. Each small correction rewrote the narrative. I wasn't the support system anymore. I was just a person who had stepped back. What changed most was me. I noticed how my days grew steadier without the background hum of obligation. My self-worth recalibrated, no longer tied to usefulness. I slept better. I spoke less but meant more. When I did see him, across rooms, across conversations, there was a new distance he couldn't cross with charm or familiarity. Why should anyone care? Because this is how patterns end in real life. Not with explosions, but with exits. Because quiet boundaries teach louder lessons than arguments ever could. And because choosing yourself doesn't require cruelty, just the courage to stop paying for someone else's comfort with your own. In the months that followed, nothing extraordinary happened, and that was the gift. My life stopped revolving around someone else's needs. I made decisions without bracing for impact. I learned the difference between being kind and being available, between love and labor. The silence I once feared became spacious, something I could move around in without bumping into guilt. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. I still help, still care, still listen, but now there's a gate and I decide who gets a key. The future looks practical in the best way. A place of my own, money that stays where I put it, relationships that don't confuse access with intimacy. No triangles. No debts disguised as affection. Sometimes I think about that sentence. We'll always be friends, though, and I almost smile. Not because it hurt less, but because I understand it now. It was never a promise. It was a request for continuity without accountability. I didn't argue. I didn't punish. I didn't announce a boundary and dare him to cross it. I simply stepped into a life where I was no longer required to explain my worth. And the quiet revenge was this. I stopped being useful and started being free.